Welcome back to the whiteboard, River. Let us do this again.
Thanks, Erica. There is a real-world story behind this topic that ties everything together. Let us start there. December 2020. Security teams at the U.S. Treasury, the Department of Homeland Security, and dozens of Fortune 500 companies all ran a product called SolarWinds Orion. It was patched. It passed every scan. The attackers had been inside their networks for 9 months. Every control said green. The risk was never identified because it was hiding inside the software update itself.
That is what risk management is really about, not just the threats you know to patch, but the structured discipline of identifying, measuring, and responding to uncertainty before it becomes a breach. Welcome to CISSP 1.9.
This is one of the most tested subtopics in Domain 1. Risk management underpins everything in the C. ISSP, Asset Security, Access Management, Architecture Decisions. Without a grip on quantitative and qualitative analysis, those other domains become harder to reason through.
NIST SB 800-30 is the primary reference the CISSP exam draws from for risk terminology. The formulas, the vocabulary, the risk response framework, all of it traces back to that document. We will be citing it throughout.
In this video, we cover threat and vulnerability identification, the full annualized loss expectancy formula chain, qualitative matrices and heat maps, and the 4 valid risk response strategies, including the wrong answer the exam loves to plant. We close with SolarWinds. Let me introduce the team real quick.
I am excited to watch this one unfold. I will jump in when I cannot help myself.
Hey, I'm Liam. I came in skeptical, but now I am genuinely fascinated.
Nova here, the data on this is wild. You will see what I mean.
All right, let us jump in.
Before you can analyze risk, you need to speak the vocabulary precisely. The exam tests definitions, and the definitions are more specific than most candidates assume. A threat is any circumstance or event with the potential to cause harm to an asset.
NIST SB 800-30 draws a distinction between threat source and threat event. The threat source is what initiates the harm, a nation-state actor, a disgruntled employee, a natural disaster. The threat event is the specific action, like a phishing campaign or a data center fire.
A vulnerability is the weakness the threat can exploit. An unpatched server is a vulnerability. Weak password policies are a vulnerability. Inadequate physical access controls are a vulnerability. No vulnerability means no successful exploit, which is exactly why patching matters so much. The threat always needs an opening. Close the opening and the threat has nowhere to go.
Impact is what happens when the threat successfully exploits the vulnerability. Data loss, financial damage, regulatory fines, reputational harm, operational downtime. The impact assessment is what tells you whether you have a low-stakes annoyance or a business-ending event.
The conceptual formula risk equals threat times vulnerability times impact is a reasoning framework, not a literal equation. If any one of those 3 factors is 0, risk approaches 0. No threat means no risk. No vulnerability means no exploit path. 0 impact means nothing worth managing. The exam tests whether you understand that logic, not just that you can recite the formula.
Nova, where does the exam like to trip candidates on these definitions?
Confusing threat with risk. A hurricane is a threat. The risk is the potential business disruption if your data center sits in a flood zone with no alternate site. Candidates who mix up those 2 terms tend to pick wrong on every scenario question that follows. Quantitative risk analysis assigns real dollar values to potential losses. Every term in this chain appears on the CISSP exam, usually in scenario questions where you must calculate or interpret a result. Let me walk through each one in order. Asset value is the monetary value of the asset. This is not just replacement cost, it is business value. A database server hardware might cost $5,000 to replace. But if it stores the customer records that drive your entire revenue model, the asset value is in the tens of millions.
Exposure factor is a percentage, the proportion of the asset's value lost in a single incident. If a fire destroys 40% of a warehouse, the exposure factor is 40%. If ransomware encrypts 100% of a file share and backups are also compromised, exposure factor is 100%.
Single loss expectancy is the first formula. Single loss expectancy equals asset value times exposure factor. It tells you the dollar loss from a single occurrence of the threat. This is the per incident cost, before you account for how often it happens.
Annualized rate of occurrence is the expected frequency of the threat per year. An annualized rate of occurrence of 1 means the threat occurs once per year. An annualized rate of occurrence of 0.5 means once every 2 years. This number comes from historical data, threat intelligence, and industry benchmarks.
Annualized loss expectancy is the final formula. Annualized loss expectancy equals single loss expectancy times annualized rate of occurrence. This is the expected annual dollar loss from a specific threat against a specific asset. This number is what executives and auditors want to see. It turns risk into a financial forecast, and it is what the CISSP exam tests you to calculate and interpret. Liam, tell them why annualized loss expectancy matters beyond the exam.
Annualized loss expectancy is your budget justification. If a control costs less per year than the annualized loss expectancy it reduces, the math supports buying the control. It is how security professionals speak the language of finance, and that language is what gets controls approved at the executive level.
Let me walk you through a complete annualized loss expectancy calculation. You have a web application server. Its business value, including the data it holds, the revenue it drives, and the operational cost if it goes down, is $400,000.
The threat is ransomware. Your security team estimates that if ransomware hits this server, you can recover some data from backup, but you lose significant files and operational time. The exposure factor is 60%, 60 cents lost for every dollar of asset value per incident.
Single loss expectancy, $400,000 times 0.6 equals $240,000 per incident. That is the expected cost each time this specific threat successfully hits this specific asset. Hold that number.
Threat intelligence shows organizations in your industry face a ransomware event against a web server roughly once every 2 years. Annualized rate of occurrence, 0.5. Stick with me, this is where the two numbers come together.
Annualized loss expectancy, $240,000 times 0.5 equals $120,000 per year. That is the expected annual cost from ransomware on this asset. Now you have a number you can take to a CFO.
If you propose a control that costs $70,000 per year and reduces the annualized loss expectancy from $120,000 to $40,000, you have saved $80,000 annually. The math justifies the spend. That is how security decisions get funded at the executive level.
Erica, flag the exam trap in this calculation.
In practice, asset value and exposure factor are estimated, they carry uncertainty. But the exam treats these inputs as precise. When you see an annualized loss expectancy scenario question, do not overthink the estimates. Plug in the numbers and calculate. The right answer is the arithmetic result, not a philosophical objection to the model.
Quantitative analysis is precise, but it requires accurate dollar values for assets, which many organizations cannot confidently produce. That is where qualitative risk analysis steps in. Instead of calculating exact dollar losses, qualitative analysis uses descriptive scales: low, medium, high.
ISO 27005 and CISSP 800-30 both describe qualitative analysis as a valid and widely used method. The output is a risk rating rather than a dollar figure. You score each risk on 2 axes, likelihood and impact.
A simple matrix works like this. High likelihood plus high impact lands in the top right corner, a critical risk. Low likelihood and low impact lands in the bottom left, a risk you might accept. The matrix forces you to prioritize based on the combination of both factors.
Risk heat maps take the matrix and make it visual: green for acceptable risk, yellow for monitored risk, red for immediate action. Executives love heat maps because they communicate the entire risk portfolio in one glance. CISO present them to boards. Auditors use them during assessments. The CISSP expects you to understand how they are constructed and what each color zone means. Later in this video, we tie this directly to the SolarWinds case, because SolarWinds shows what happens when the heat map has the wrong risks on it.
Here is the distinction the exam will test. Quantitative analysis requires accurate data and produces defensible dollar figures. Qualitative is faster and works when data is limited, but it is inherently subjective. Two analysts can score the same risk differently.
Neither method is always superior. The CISSP expects you to know when each is appropriate. In practice, mature organizations use both: qualitative to triage, quantitative to justify the controls that survive triage.
Once you have measured and prioritized risk, you must respond to it. ISC² defines 4 valid risk response strategies, and the CISSP exam tests all 4 regularly. Learn them precisely. The answer choices are designed to confuse you.
Risk acceptance means you acknowledge the risk, document it formally, and choose not to implement additional controls, usually because the cost of controls exceeds the annualized loss expectancy, or because the risk is within your defined risk tolerance. Acceptance is a deliberate management decision. It is not the same as ignoring the risk.
Risk mitigation means you implement controls to reduce likelihood or impact. Patching a vulnerability is mitigation. Adding multi-factor authentication is mitigation. Encrypting sensitive data at rest is mitigation. This is the most common response for high-probability, high-impact risks. You are not removing the risk, you are reducing it to an acceptable level.
Risk transference shifts the financial consequence of the risk to a third party. Cyber liability insurance is the classic example. Contractual liability clauses that make a vendor responsible for a breach in their system are another. Transference does not eliminate the risk. It changes who pays when the loss occurs.
Risk avoidance means you eliminate the activity or asset that creates the risk entirely. A company decides not to store credit card data at all, instead passing payment processing to a compliant third party. That eliminates the cardholder data risk by removing the asset.
Now for the exam trap. You may see reject or ignore listed as a risk response option. It is not valid. ISC² does not recognize reject or ignore as a strategy. Acceptance is the formal, documented decision. Ignoring risk is negligence, and when the exam shows you reject or ignore as an answer choice, it is always wrong. This trips candidates with real-world experience because they have seen managers wave off risks informally.
River, give us the cross-domain connection before we go to the SolarWinds case.
Risk transfer ties into Domain 1 compliance topics, legal and contract law. Risk avoidance connects to asset security decisions in Domain 2. Risk mitigation drives control selection in CISSP 1.10. Every response strategy has downstream implications across the entire CISSP body of knowledge. Let me take you back to December 2020. FireEye, one of the top cybersecurity firms in the world, discovered that its red team tools had been stolen. The investigation led to SolarWinds Orion, a widely used network monitoring platform. The attackers, attributed to Russia's SVR, had compromised the software build pipeline at SolarWinds months earlier. They inserted malicious code into a software update. Approximately 18,000 organizations downloaded and installed it.
Here is the risk management lesson. Every breached organization had applied the patch. They had done their vulnerability management. Their threat models covered external attackers and phishing. No one had a threat in their model labeled. The software vendor's build server has been compromised, and the update itself is the weapon. That entry simply did not exist.
This is the definition of a risk that was not identified, not unmitigated, not identified. NIST SB 800-30 emphasizes that risk framing determines which risks you can even analyze. If supply chain is not in the threat model, it produces no risk entries. It gets no annualized loss expectancy calculation and no control assignment.
The connection to CISSP 1.12 supply chain risk management is direct. That subtopic covers exactly the controls that could have changed the outcome. Software bill of materials, vendor security assessments, code signing, and build pipeline integrity checks.
The takeaway for the exam: risk identification is not a one-time checklist. It must evolve as the threat landscape evolves. SolarWinds did not fail at risk mitigation, it failed at risk identification. The controls were applied to the wrong threat model.
Here is the anchor. If you forget everything else from this video, remember this one thing. Risk management is only as good as the threats and vulnerabilities you have identified. The SolarWinds attackers did not beat the controls. They operated in the gap the threat model had not drawn.
Drop in the comments, has your organization ever found a risk that was completely missing from the formal risk register, something outside the original threat model? We read every response and it shapes what we build next in this series.
Subscribe so you do not miss CISSP 1.10 Risk Management in Practice, where we cover countermeasure selection, control types, and the cost-benefit analysis framework that turns annualized loss expectancy calculations into security budgets.
All right, quiz time. Let's find out what's stuck. Think through each question carefully before you answer.
Every subscriber helps us justify making more of these. Smash subscribe and let us keep going.
A web server has an asset value of $500,000. A ransomware threat has an exposure factor of 50% and is expected once every 2 years. What is the annualized loss expectancy? The correct answer is D, $125,000.
A security manager recommends stopping all collection of customer social security numbers to eliminate the associated data breach risk. Which risk response strategy does this represent? The correct answer is B, risk avoidance.
Which of the following is not a valid risk response strategy recognized by ISC² for the CISSP exam? The correct answer is B, risk rejection.
Strong work on the quiz. Let me give you the complete picture of what we covered. Risk management is not about eliminating uncertainty. It is about identifying, measuring, and making deliberate decisions about uncertainty. That distinction separates security leaders from security technicians.
The vocabulary matters. Threats are potential harm, vulnerabilities are the weaknesses they exploit, and impact is the consequence when they connect. Risk equals threat times vulnerability times impact, a reasoning tool, not a literal equation.
Quantitative analysis gives you the full formula chain. Asset value times exposure factor equals single loss expectancy. Single loss expectancy times annualized rate of occurrence equals annualized loss expectancy. That annualized loss expectancy figure justifies control spend. Qualitative analysis uses likelihood impact matrices and heat maps when dollar data is unavailable.
The 4 valid risk responses are accept, mitigate, transfer, and avoid. Reject and ignore are exam traps, never valid answers. And SolarWinds is the case that ties it all together, not a failure of controls, but a failure of identification. The threat was never in the model.
Watch the next video. CISSP 1.10 covers risk management in practice, countermeasure selection, the cost-benefit analysis framework, control types, and how NIST risk management framework and ISO 31000 structure the ongoing risk program. The annualized loss expectancy formulas from this video feed directly into the control decisions covered there.
Subscribe so you do not miss it. Every video in Block 1 builds on the last, and risk management is the foundation that everything in Domain 1 rests on.
Stay curious, everyone.
Impressive work, River. I almost did not want to interrupt. Professor Erica, signing off.